Hello everyone, it's Zest. Calculated Compression Collapse, The Crushing of Common Citizens, Part 4. The Volcker Shock, The Beginning of the End. Enter Paul Volcker, the Fed's Grim Reaper in a three-piece suit. The appointment of Paul Volcker as Federal Reserve Chairman in 1979 marked the beginning of the most aggressive phase of the assault on middle-class prosperity. In the early 80s, he hoisted interest rates to the moon at levels that would have embarrassed medieval usurers, over 20% in some cases, deliberately engineering the deepest recession since the Great Depression. The stated goal was to tame inflation, but the real target was organized labor's spine and the expectation of rising wages that had characterized the post-war period. Another intended effect was to increase corporate profitability while decimating manufacturing employment. This marked the end of the Great Compression. As William Greider notes in his book, Secrets of the Temple, How the Federal Reserve Runs the Country, Volcker's shock therapy wasn't just about prices, it was class warfare, pure and simple. The social contract of 1946 was shredded, and corporate profits soared as workers' wages flatlined. Volcker himself acknowledged the class warfare nature of his policies. While clutching a card tracking union wage settlements, he explicitly stated to the Wall Street Journal his determination to break organized labor. When asked by the editors whether he would maintain his tight monetary policy, even when there's blood all over the floor, Volcker, with a wicked grin, responded affirmatively. And blood there was. Unemployment hit 10.8% in 1982, unions crumbled, and manufacturing jobs vanished like a magician's rabbit. But for Volcker and his allies, this was not an unfortunate side effect, but the intended result. As IMF official Michael Mussa later acknowledged, the Federal Reserve had to demonstrate its willingness to spill blood, lots of blood, other people's blood, to establish its credibility. The Volcker recession demonstrated to workers everywhere that their prosperity existed only at the sufferance of their betters. Union membership began its long, precipitous decline, falling from 20% of the workforce in 1980 to 12% by 1990. Real wages stagnated for most workers, while corporate profits soared. The implicit social contract of the post-war period, that workers would share in the fruits of economic growth, was permanently broken, reduced to an historical footnote. The Volcker shock also marked the beginning of the financialization of the American economy. As manufacturing was devastated by high interest rates and an overvalued dollar, financial services became increasingly important and easily promoted. The shift from an economy based on production to one based on financial speculation was not a natural evolution, but the result of deliberate policy choices that favored capital over labor. The 2008 masterpiece, The House Always Wins. The 2008 financial crisis represented the apotheosis of elite strategy, a financial crisis born of deregulated greed and subprime sleight of hand. This crisis was not an accident. It was the predictable result of policies designed to substitute debt for wages. The elites championed decades of financial deregulation, debt-fueled consumption, and financial speculation. This created the conditions for a speculative bubble built on fraudulent subprime mortgages. The Fed's policies of low rates throughout the 1990s and 2000s, the promotion of home ownership through subprime lending, and Wall Street's casino bets on housing fueled speculative bubbles in housing and other assets, while ignoring stagnant wages and soaring household debt. The inevitable crash was used as an opportunity to accelerate the wealth transfer that had been underway for decades. When the crisis hit and bubbles burst with operatic flair, the response revealed the true priorities of the system with crystalline clarity. Bail out the banks, let Main Street drown. The Fed and the Treasury orchestrated a bailout that socialized the losses of the banks while privatizing their gains. The banks that had caused the crisis were rescued with trillions of dollars of public money, while the millions of homeowners who lost their homes, savings, and jobs ate dirt while getting verbal spankings on moral hazard and personal responsibility. Socializing losses while privatizing gains is the oldest trick in the plutocrat's playbook. The crisis served to further concentrate wealth at the very top and plunge a new generation into precariousness. The contrast between the treatment of Wall Street and Main Street could not have been starker. Home ownership rates, which had been rising since the 1940s, began to decline sharply. The crisis also accelerated trends that had been underway for decades. Real wages, which had been stagnating since the 1970s, fell further behind the cost of living. The wealth gap, which had been growing since the 1980s, reached levels not seen since the 1920s. Perhaps most importantly, the crisis destroyed the last vestiges of the expectation that hard work and playing by the rules would lead to prosperity. For millions of Americans, the 2008 crisis was the final proof that the system was rigged against them. This recognition would have important political consequences, contributing to the rise of populist movements on both the left and right. Far from reversing course, the elite doubled down. The Federal Reserve's response, quantitative easing, QE, and near-zero interest rates, pumped air into asset prices, fattening the portfolios of the 1%, while workers' wages stayed stuck. It further accelerated the transfer of wealth from workers to capital owners. In other words, by inflating asset prices, enriching the investor class, while doing little for ordinary workers whose wages remained stagnant. These policies ensured that the benefits of recovery would flow primarily to those who already owned substantial assets. It was a perfect demonstration of socialism for the rich and capitalism for the poor. The crisis wasn't a bug, but a feature, accelerating the wealth gap to Gilded Age levels. The 2008 crisis was also used as an excuse to further erode labor protections, cut public services, and privatize remaining common goods. This process is not over. The end is not here. Another Fed-induced calamity appears to be in the planning, with interest rate policies once again tightening at the first sign of wage growth. The immense buildup of public and private debt, coupled with the Fed's current policy tightrope, suggests that another, perhaps final, Fed-induced crisis is being planned to finally complete the transfer of wealth, finish off the remnants of middle-class prosperity, and solidify a neo-feudal economic order. In sum, in 2008, the Ponzi scheme collapsed. Again. But this time, there was no New Deal cavalry. Instead, the banks got champagne and the people got foreclosure notices. This wasn't just a crisis, it was a wealth transfer. The Fed printed trillions to keep Wall Street solvent, while Main Street was told to tighten its belt and smile for the cameras. The universe, in its infinite jest, had turned the American dream into a cruel lottery where the house always wins. The Great Hollowing Out of America. A major piece of the plan involves fundamentally restructuring the American economy to favor mobile capital over stationary labor. The systematic destruction of American manufacturing was a crucial element of the assault on middle-class prosperity. The gutting of American manufacturing was no accident but a surgical strike. Post-Volcker, factories fled to low-wage havens, egged on by free trade deals like NAFTA and China's WTO entry. The best factory jobs, the bedrock of the unionized middle class, were shipped overseas to low-wage countries. This process, euphemistically called deindustrialization, was presented as the inevitable result of global competition. In reality, it was a deliberate strategy to break the power of organized labor and reduce wages by relocating production to countries with lower wages and weaker labor protections, and where workers could be exploited more efficiently. The massive campaign and process of deindustrialization began in the 1970s, but accelerated dramatically after the Volcker shock with the full support of government policy. The beauty of this arrangement was that it allowed American corporations to maintain the threat of relocation as a permanent sword hanging over domestic workers' heads. Why grant a raise when you could simply remind workers that their jobs could be moved to Mexico, China, or Bangladesh at any moment? They called it labor arbitrage, a fancy term for screwing the worker to fatten corporate wallets while undercutting American workers. The threat of outsourcing became a whip, forcing concessions from workers who'd rather eat crow than lose their jobs. High interest rates and an overvalued dollar made American manufacturing non-competitive, forcing plant closures and job losses. But rather than adjusting these policies to protect American workers, policymakers embraced deindustrialization as a preferred adaptation to global competition. The promotion of free trade agreements were presented as beneficial to American consumers through lower prices. But the real beneficiaries were American corporations, which could now threaten workers with relocation to maintain wage discipline. The mere threat of outsourcing became a powerful tool for suppressing wages and benefits. These high-wage manufacturing jobs were not replaced with equivalents. The jobs that replaced manufacturing were predominantly in the service sector, retail, food service, and home care, offering lower wages, fewer benefits, and less job security and weaker union representation. The American economy was transformed from one that made things to one that served things, with predictable effects on worker bargaining power. The archetypal employers of the new economy became Walmart, fast food chains, and home care agencies, offering insecure part-time work with few or no benefits. This transformation of the American economy from one based on production to one based on services was not a natural evolution, but the result of deliberate policy choices that favored capital mobility over worker security. The result? The human cost of deindustrialization was enormous. Communities that had been built around manufacturing employment were devastated. They were hollowed out, families shattered, and high-wage union jobs replaced by Walmart greeter gigs. Workers who had expected to have secure, well-paying jobs for life found themselves competing for low-wage service positions. The social fabric of industrial communities was torn apart as families were forced to relocate in search of employment. The elites sold it as global competition, but it was a deliberate choice to prioritize capital's freedom of movement over labor's assurance.